So after glycolysis, there are two options for this pyruvic acid. Either it can go on to the mitochondria and with oxygen can be converted into a lot of ATP, or when there is little oxygen present, the pyruvic acid will be converted into something else. So that's called fermentation. Fermentation happens in the cytosol right after glycolysis. So it's just there. It doesn't produce any ATP. The only reason why fermentation occurs is to get back to that NAD plus. Because once you have that NAD plus, glycolysis can happen again. And so the product of fermentation is a waste product. It's a product that the cell is not wanting and will just release. So the two kinds of fermentation that we're going to have you learn in this class is lactic acid fermentation and ethyl alcohol fermentation. But you can see down here, there are other kinds of fermentation where they produce different compounds. And as humans, we have learned to take advantage of these bacteria, mostly, and maybe some yeast, that produce chemical compounds that we might want. So let's talk lactic acid fermentation. So we talked about glycolysis, where we take our 6-carbon glucose. We're going to make 2 ATP. We're going to make it into 2 pyruvate molecules or 2 pyruvic acid molecules. NAD plus is turned into NADH. So now we got this pyruvate, but we don't have oxygen. So since we don't have oxygen, the only thing the cell can do is to get rid of this 2-pyruvate and to get back the NAD plus. So when NADH reduces the 2-pyruvate by adding, it's really like 4 electrons and 2 hydrogen ions to the 2 pyruvates, it changes pyruvic acid into lactic acid. Lactic acid is then just released by the cell out into the world. So it's a product that it makes. It's a waste product. It doesn't need it. And again, the whole purpose is because then you have NAD plus, and now glycolysis can happen again, and then the cell can make 2 more ATP. If you didn't do this, all of the NADs would be locked as NADH, and there would be no glycolysis, and the cell would make no ATP, and then the cell would die. So it needs to find a way to recycle the NAD enzyme so that it can keep doing glycolysis. So like I said, we as humans, we take advantage of fermentation. So we have found what bacteria does what, and so a lot of our cheeses, buttermilk, yogurt, sour cream, they're all made with a bacteria being placed into milk that creates these products. So by lactic acid fermentation, that's how we get cheese. And then in your muscles, our muscles, all animal cells, if you are lacking in oxygen for some reason, normally we say in our muscles because that's really the only time that we're lacking oxygen is if we're working our muscles really hard, we're breathing hard, our heart is pumping, but it's still not getting enough oxygen to our muscles, then our muscles will do some fermentation to keep going. And that builds up lactic acid in your muscle cells or around your muscle cells, makes your muscle cells more acidic, and then it just basically reduces the ability of your cells to contract. So that would be what you would call cramps. Like if you get cramping, it's probably a lactic acid buildup. So that's caused because your muscle cells did fermentation for a while it wasn't getting enough oxygen. Yeast also does, some yeast also does lactic acid fermentation. Now, the other kind of fermentation that we're going to go ahead and talk about is called alcoholic fermentation. Really, it's making the alcohol called ethanol. So there's many different types of alcohols, but the one that humans can drink, although it is a poison, it doesn't kill you unless you drink too much. And of course, everybody, adults enjoy the effect of ethanol on their bodies. So yeast and bacteria, and then some plant cells actually do alcoholic fermentation. It's almost the same process, but different things are happening. So the 2-pyruvate are going to be reduced by NADH. Again, 4 electrons are going to go into these 2 pyruvates. 2 hydrogen ions are as well. But then 2 carbon dioxides come out. And what you end up making is a 2-carbon compound called ethanol. So, and we have two ethanols, right? That is made. Again, the whole purpose is really just to recycle the NAD, because that enzyme would be full of electrons and hydrogen ions, and we have to get rid of those things so that it can come back up here and do glycolysis. And so CO2 is a waste product. It's just released by the cell. And ethanol is a waste product that's just released by the cell and sent out into the world. So yeast is used to produce wine and beer with various liquids that they put the yeast in to create both those wine and the beer. And then yeast is actually what we use to make bread rise. So I mentioned in our earlier video, how does that happen, that bread rising? That happens because we wake up the yeast, we feed them some sugar, glucose, and then they start making carbon dioxide. And that carbon dioxide is what makes the bread rise. The smell of the bread comes from the alcohol that it's producing. Now, bread won't make you drunk because once you cook the bread, the alcohol evaporates away. And so cooked bread does not contain any alcohol, but it still has that flavor in the bread. So once again, this is fermentation, some of the different bacteria that are used, and some of the products that are made. Swiss cheese is a different type of fermentation. It's not lactic acid, but over here you can see even like soy sauce. And then like nail polish remover or rubbing alcohol is made because a bacteria does this fermentation, and vinegar is made because of fermentation. So there's a lot of things that we have in our life taking advantage of organisms that do fermentation. Whole purpose of fermentation, to get that NAD plus back, right? And then they can start making ATP by glycolysis. This is fermentation.